You wait before dawn in a small house made of mud brick. The room is still dark, and the air holds a pleasant coolness that rests gently on your skin, a leftover chill from the desert night that has seeped through the thick walls. You rise slowly from the simple reed mat that has been your bed, the woven stalk slightly rough under your palms, and you take a moment to fold the sleeping linen into a neat square, placing it to one side on the packed earth floor where it will stay until evening. Through the low doorway that leads to the outside, you can see the very first pale light beginning to touch the tops of the eastern hills, just a faint grey line that promises the sun without yet showing any warmth. The house is quiet, the walls made of the same mud and straw that form the rest of the village, and the only sound is the soft rustle of your own movement and the distant, muffled stirring of a neighbor's household. You walk across the single room to the small storage area where a clay bowl holds pieces of flat bread left from the previous day's baking, the surface of the bread slightly pitted and dry. You take one piece and eat it standing, chewing slowly while you look through the doorway at the brightening sky, the taste familiar and plain. Then you drink a cup of water dipped from a large pottery jar that stands in the corner, the jar's surface cool and faintly damp to the touch, its interior dark and smelling of clean clay. You pour the water carefully so as not to spill a drop, and you drink it in unhurried swallows, feeling it wet your throat. After that, you turn your attention to your tools, which are kept in a niche beside the doorway, a shallow hollow in the wall that holds the things you need every day. There are several reed brushes of different thicknesses, each cut to a fine point or flattened for broad strokes, the ends stained faintly with old pigment despite careful washing. You check that the bristles are clean and undamaged, running a thumb lightly over the tips to feel for any split or splayed fibers. You pick up a small grinding stone, a smooth oval of hard basalt that fits comfortably in your palm, its surface worn to a slight polish from years of crushing minerals into powder. Beside it, you take a folded square of linen for wiping your hands during the day's work, the cloth already marked with smudges of ochre and charcoal that will never wash out. These items you place one by one into a shoulder bag woven from palm fibers, a sturdy, open-topped container that has served you for many months without fraying. The bag settles against your hip as you adjust its strap, and you take one last look around the room to be sure you have forgotten nothing. Outside, the village path is made of packed dust and scattered stones, pale in the early light, and already you can see the shapes of other workers moving toward the painter's workshop at the edge of Deir el-Medina. You step out and join the slow flow of men and a few women, all walking in the same direction, a quiet procession of sandaled feet that raises little puffs of fine dust. The sky above has shifted from dark blue to a softer grey blue, and the stars that were visible moments ago have faded completely. No one speaks much. The morning is for gathering oneself, for feeling the air shift from cool to warm as the sun climbs higher, and the only sounds are footsteps, the occasional cough, and the distant bark of a dog from some unseen corner of the village. You pass the houses of your neighbors, each one a low rectangular box of mud brick with a flat roof of palm beams, their small windows still dark. Some doorways have a small lamp burning inside, a tiny point of orange flame that wavers as someone moves past it. You notice the texture of the walls, the slight unevenness where the builders smoothed wet mud with their hands, and the way the plastered surface has cracked in places from the dry heat. The path follows the natural contour of the low hills that surround the village, winding gently upward in some places and flattening in others, always dusty and pale underfoot. To your left, far across the cultivated fields and the river you cannot see directly, the Nile is a distant glint of silver grey in the growing light, a narrow band that marks the boundary between the black land and the red desert. But you are walking westward, away from the river, toward the limestone cliffs that rise in massive layers of cream and tan, their faces already catching the early sunlight and beginning to glow with a soft, warm hue. The temperature is still gentle enough that you do not sweat, and your sandals make a soft, rhythmic sound on the compacted earth, a steady shush, shush that blends with the footsteps of those around you into a single, continuous murmur. The air carries the faint smell of dust, dry herb, and the clean scent of open land that has not seen rain for many months. Every few paces you notice a small detail, a lizard darting between two rocks, a beetle pushing a ball of dung across the path, the shadow of a bird passing swiftly over the ground without a sound. After some minutes of this unhurried walking, the village buildings thin out and give way to open ground dotted with low scrub and pale boulders. The path becomes a little steeper as it approaches the base of the cliffs, and you adjust your pace without thinking, your legs finding the familiar rhythm of the incline. Here the silence grows deeper, interrupted only by the crunch of your own steps and the occasional shift of a pebble under a sandal. The cliffs ahead are enormous now, their vertical faces streaked with horizontal bands of darker stone, and you can see small crevices where birds have nested. You pass a small roadside shrine built of 3 flat stones, a simple structure that someone has placed at a bend in the path where the view opens toward the valley. A wilted offering of lettuce rests on the top stone, its leaves gone limp and brown at the edges, and a few dried flower petals lie scattered around the base, left from some earlier devotion. You do not stop, you simply register its presence, a familiar marker along the daily route that you have passed hundreds of times without ever seeing a living person there. Beyond the shrine, the path levels out for a short distance before dipping into a shallow depression where the dust is thicker and your footprints leave deep marks. You notice that the prints of those who walked ahead of you are already filling with the fine grains that the breeze pushes along the ground, a slower racing that will be complete by midday. The light now is full and golden, the sun having risen above the eastern hills so that your own shadow stretches out long and thin before you, moving like a silent companion. The heat is still mild, but you can feel the promise of the afternoon in the way the air holds a faint shimmer near the ground. You shift the strap of your bag slightly where it has begun to press on your shoulder, and you continue walking with the same steady, unhurried gait that you keep every morning. The workshop comes into view after you round a final curve where the cliffs open into a wide, flat area. It is a low, sprawling building made of the same mud brick as the houses, but larger, with a wide shaded courtyard at its front that extends beneath the roof of palm logs and woven matting. The matting filters the sunlight into dappled patches that move slowly across the beaten earth floor as the sun climbs, and even from a distance you can see that the master painter's assistants have already been busy. They have set out the day's supplies, baskets of raw pigment lumps in various colors, some dark green, some yellow-brown, some a pale blue-gray that will become Egyptian blue after grinding. Stacked nearby are flat grinding pallets of smooth stone, each one slightly cupped from years of use, and beside them stand several large jars of water with wooden dippers floating on the surface. Small pottery pots wait in neat rows, each one destined to hold a single color after it has been ground and mixed with binder. You enter the courtyard through a wide opening without a door, and the temperature immediately drops a few degrees, the shade offering a gentle relief from the sun that now beats down more directly on the open path. You find your usual place beside a low bench, a spot you have occupied for so many seasons that the ground beneath it is packed smooth and the bench itself has a slight hollow where you always sit. You set down your shoulder bag and begin to remove your tools one at a time, placing them in a careful arrangement. The grinding stone goes in front of you on a flat piece of limestone that serves as a work surface. The brushes are laid out to your right in order of thickness, and the linen cloth is tucked under the edge of the bench so it will stay clean. The courtyard is quiet in the way that a place can be quiet when many people are present, but no one is speaking loudly. Other painters arriving and settling into their own spaces, some greeting each other with a simple nod, others already crouching before their palettes and inspecting the pigment lumps. The assistants move among them, topping up water jars and placing fresh baskets of raw material where they are needed. One assistant, a young man with his hair cropped short, brings a small grinding slab and sets it beside your bench, even though you already have one. He does this every day without being asked, and every day you give a slight nod of acknowledgement before he moves on. The master painter is standing at the far end of the courtyard, near a set of shelves that hold finished pots of color, and he is consulting a scrap of papyrus on which the day's assignments are noted in quick, black strokes. He glances up once, then returns to his reading without calling anyone over yet. The soft sounds of the courtyard are a blend of many small noises, the scrape of a basket being dragged across the floor, the clink of a dipper against a jar rim, the low murmur of two painters discussing the consistency of a particular blue, the tap of a reed brush being tested on a piece of waste plaster. A pair of doves coos from the edge of the roof matting, their voices a low and steady rhythm that repeats in a pattern of 3 notes. You take your grinding stone in your hand, feeling its familiar weight and coolness, and you look at the basket of pigment lumps that has been placed within easy reach. The lumps are rough and irregular, some as large as a walnut, others small as a pebble. All of them, the raw material that will become the bright, flat colors on a tomb wall deep inside the valley. You select one piece of malachite and hold it up to the light, seeing the dull green luster that hides inside its dark exterior. Then you set it on your grinding slab and settle yourself more comfortably on the bench, waiting for the master to give the quiet word that will begin the day's labor. The sun has not yet reached its full height. The air in the courtyard is still cool enough to be pleasant, and you sit there with the patience of a man who has done this work for so many years that time itself moves in the slow, measured circles of the grinding stone. The courtyard is half in shadow and half in early sun, the palm frond roof breaking the light into shifting patterns on the packed earth floor. You set your shoulder bag down beside the low bench and sit, the stone of the bench still cool from the night air. In front of you rests a flat pallet of dark basalt, its surface worn to a gentle hollow that cups the light. A young apprentice, the same one with the cropped hair, brings a wide basket of raw pigment lumps and places it on the ground to your left, the pieces clicking softly against one another as the basket settles. He moves away without a word, and you are left with the day's first task. You reach into the basket, and your fingers find a chunk of deep green malachite, rough and heavy, its outer surface dull with a faint sparkle where the light catches a crystal edge. You place it in the center of the grinding stone and take up the handstone, a rounded oval of hard stone that fits perfectly in your right palm. The weight of it is familiar, a balanced heaviness that you've held in this same way for season after season, way for season after season. You bring it down onto the malachite with a gentle, controlled pressure, and the first crack runs through the mineral with a small, sharp sound that is swallowed immediately by the larger quiet of the courtyard. You press again, adjusting the angle, and the chunk splits into several smaller pieces that scatter slightly across the basalt. You gather them back into a pile with your fingers and begin to crush them further. A steady downward tapping that reduces each piece into coarse granules, then into a gritty powder that spreads across the dark stone like green sand. The sound of your handstone is a low, grinding rasp, a rhythmic scritch that fills the space around your bench and blends with the same sound coming from the other painters stationed around the courtyard. Some are grinding blue frit, their stones making a slightly higher pitch. Others are working ochre, which produces a softer, more muffled grating. Together these sounds form a continuous, low drone, a background texture that has become as natural as breathing. You work the handstone in slow, deliberate circles now, moving it around the entire surface of the grinding slab so that every particle of malachite is caught under the weight. The coarse powder becomes finer and finer, the individual grains too small to see, until you feel the texture change under the stone from a rough drag to a smooth, silky glide. You pause and add a little water from a small pottery bowl that sits by your knee, dipping 2 fingers into the bowl and letting the drops fall onto the green powder. The water pools briefly on the surface before it soaks in, darkening the color, and you resume the circular motion. The powder turns into a thick slurry that moves under the stone in slow waves, a deep green paste the color of papyrus stems after the flood. You work it in unhurried rounds, your wrist rotating with a steady rhythm that has become automatic, while your other hand rests lightly on the edge of the slab to hold it steady. Round and round, the same motion repeated without variation, the paste spreads and gathers, thins and thickens, until you feel no more grit at all. You lift the handstone and wipe its underside with a linen cloth, then test the paste by dipping the tip of your little finger into it. The color is rich and even, without any sandy texture, and when you rub it between your thumb and finger, it feels as smooth as river mud after the silt has settled. Satisfied, You take a small flat spatula made of bone and scrape the paste carefully from the grinding slab, transferring it into a small pottery pot that waits on the bench. You work the spatula around the curves of the hollow, gathering every last trace of green, and then wipe the slab clean with a damp corner of the linen cloth so that no residue remains to contaminate the next color. Next, you select a lump of yellow ochre from the basket, a soft, crumbly stone that breaks easily between your fingers. You place it on the clean grinding surface and begin the process again, though this mineral behaves differently under the stone. The ochre crushes almost immediately into a fine dry powder that puffs up in a small yellow cloud when the handstone first touches it, and you pause to let the dust settle before continuing. It grinds more quickly than malachite, yielding a soft, warm powder that requires only a few drops of water to turn into a thick paste, the color of desert sand in late afternoon. The handstone moves in its familiar circles, and you watch the ochre spread into an even layer, its color shifting from pale mustard to a deeper golden brown as the water mixes in. You scrape this paste into a second pot, cleaning the slab once more before reaching for a piece of Egyptian blue, a hard greyish lump that looks nothing like the bright celestial color it will become. This one requires more effort, the handstone pressing down with greater weight, and you feel the vibration travel through your wrist and into your forearm as the stone grinds over the resistant surface. You add water in small amounts, grinding, testing, grinding again, until at last the grey powder transforms into a vivid blue that catches the light and seems almost to glow in the shaded courtyard. You scrape the blue into its own pot and set it alongside the green and yellow ochre. The morning passes in this way, selecting a lump from the basket, placing it on the slab, crushing it with the handstone, adding water drop by drop, working the paste into smoothness, scraping it into a pot, wiping the slab clean, and starting again with the next color. Red ochre follows yellow, a darker, richer red that stains your fingers as you test it. Charcoal black comes next, a soft, crumbly material made from burnt wood that grinds into a dense, matte powder and mixes into a paste so dark it seems to swallow the light. Finally, you grind the white, which is made from gypsum heated and crushed, a stubborn, chalky substance that takes patience to reduce to the proper fineness, leaving a fine white dust on your hands and the front of your kilt. You work steadily, pausing only to stretch your fingers or to wipe your brow with the back of your wrist, while the sun climbs higher and the shadow line retreats slowly across the courtyard floor. At some point during this long, slow sequence, the master painter begins to move through the workspace. He is an older man with a deliberate walk and a calm, unhurried way of looking at things. He stops at each painter's bench in turn, leaning down to peer into the small pots of prepared color, sometimes picking one up and tilting it toward the light to check the consistency. You hear his quiet voice speaking to a painter across the courtyard, asking for a blue to be ground a little thinner, for a red to be given more binder. When he reaches your bench, you pause in your work and set the handstone down. He looks into each of your pots, one after the other, his expression unchanged. He dips a clean reed sliver into the green and draws a thin line across a scrap of plaster to test the flow, nodding once. Then he does the same with the ochre and the blue, each time tilting his head slightly to observe how the color sits on the surface. He says that the white could use a touch more gum to help it adhere, and you make a small mental note while he moves the blue pot a little to the left on your bench, a tiny adjustment that seems to satisfy something in his mind. He tells you that today you will work in the tomb of a royal scribe, finishing the harvest scene on the south wall of the inner chamber. The scribe's tomb is a modest one compared to the great royal tombs deeper in the valley, but its walls have been prepared with a fine plaster and the scenes are already partly drawn. Your task will be to lay in the base colors and begin the detailing of the figures and the offerings. The master mentions that the harvest scene requires a particularly even green for the fields and a warm brown for the oxen, and he taps the green pot with his finger as if to confirm that you have ground enough. Then he moves on to the next bench, and you are left with the quiet order of things. With the master's words settling in your mind, you turn to the task of preparing the day's palette. You are given a shallow wooden tray that holds 5 small pots, each already half filled with a base of dry pigment left over from previous days. To these you add the fresh color you have just ground. The green goes into the first pot, the red ochre into the second, the Egyptian blue into the third, the charcoal black into the fourth, and the gypsum white into the fifth. You use your bone spatula to mix each pot thoroughly, incorporating the new paste with the old until the color is uniform throughout, and you add a few drops of gum arabic solution from a small stoppered jar, stirring it in with a short, blunt stick kept for that purpose. The gum is thick and honey-colored, with a faint sweet odor, and it makes the pigment slightly glossy as it blends in. You test each color again on the scrap of plaster, drawing a line of green, a dot of red, a square of blue, and you watch how the light plays on the surface. The colors are opaque and flat, exactly as they should be, without any streakiness or transparency. You clean your brushes next, the set of reed brushes that you had laid out on the bench. You dip each one into a small cup of water and work the bristles gently between your thumb and forefinger, loosening any dried pigment that might have clung to the base from the previous day. You stroke the brushes against the edge of the cup to remove excess water, then shape the tips by rolling them gently on the linen cloth until they come to fine points. The thinnest brush you set aside for the outline work, the medium one for filling broad areas, and the thickest for laying in background washes. Each brush has its place in the bag, its role in the day's labor. The courtyard around you has grown warmer, the sun now high enough that the shaded area has shrunk to a narrow strip along the western wall. The air is filled with a fine mineral dust that catches the light and makes the sunbeams visible as they slant through the gaps in the roof. Someone pours water from a jar, and the sound is a bright, liquid note that cuts through the grinding hum. A painter across the way has finished his grinding and is now carefully scraping the last of a bright blue into a pot, his movements precise and slow. Another painter is arranging his brushes in a roll of leather, tucking each one into its own narrow pocket. The young apprentice returns to collect the empty baskets and the used grinding slabs, stacking them neatly against the wall where they will be washed later. The morning has passed in its quiet, predictable way, and now there is a subtle shift in the rhythm of the workshop, a sense that the first phase of the day's work is complete. You take the 5 pots of prepared pigment, each one now capped with a small piece of flat pottery to keep the color from drying out, and you wrap the entire set in a square of damp linen cloth, folding the corners over carefully so that the moisture will be held against the pots. You place the wrapped bundle into your shoulder bag, feeling the solid weight of it settle against the other tools. You add a small stoppered jar of extra gum solution, a clean linen rag, and a stoppered flask of water. When everything is packed, you stand up from the bench and stretch your arms slowly, feeling the stiffness in your shoulders that comes from leaning over the grinding slab for long hours. Around you, the other painters are doing the same, gathering their materials and preparing for the walk into the valley. The master painter has gone to the doorway of the workshop and is looking out toward the cliffs, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his hips. The light that falls on him is the full, golden light of late morning, and beyond him the path is already beginning to shimmer with heat. You lift your bag and settle the strap across your shoulder, the familiar weight of comfort, and you join the others as they begin to drift toward the courtyard's exit. The air outside will be hot and still, but for now, in this last moment of shade, you feel the quiet satisfaction of having prepared the day's colors well and completely. The group of painters leaves the workshop as the sun climbs higher into a sky that has bleached from pale blue to a whitish gold at its center. You step from the shade of the courtyard into the full weight of the day, and the heat wraps around you all at once, a dry, pressing warmth that settles on the skin without moisture. The path that leads to the Valley of the Kings stretches westward, a pale ribbon of dust and stone winding into a wilderness of rock and empty air. You take your place in the loose, single file that the painters always form, each person a few paces behind the next, and you begin to walk. The ground underfoot is hard-packed and uneven, scattered with small, sharp stones that press through the thin soles of your sandals. To either side the land is barren, a sloping expanse of gravel and flint chips that rises toward the base of the cliffs. There is no green anywhere in this direction, no trace of plant life beyond the occasional dry, thorny scrub that looks more like twisted wire than anything living. The colors here are a narrow range: the pale cream of limestone, the chalky white of eroded surfaces, the dull grey and brown of flint nodules half buried in the ground. The sky above is a dome of heat-bleached light, and the sun beats down with a steady, patient pressure that you have long since learned to accept without complaint. You walk with the same measured pace you keep every day, a gait that covers ground without haste, your sandals lifting and falling in a soft, regular rhythm. The sound of footsteps ahead of you blends with your own, creating a dry, shuffling whisper that barely disturbs the desert silence. Occasionally, a pebble rolls under a foot and skitters off the path, the small noise, sharp and brief. The air is completely still now, holding no breeze, so that the dust you kick up rises in small puffs and settles slowly back to the earth. The heat presses down on your head and shoulders, a tangible weight that makes the skin of your arms feel tight and warm, and you can feel the first faint trickle of sweat starting along your hairline. You do not hurry. There is no need to hurry. The tomb will be there when you arrive, the walls waiting just as they were yesterday. Instead, you let your thoughts drift into the simple awareness of walking, the swing of your arms, the slight shift of your bag against your hip, the way your shadow stretches out to the side and moves alongside you like a silent companion. The landscape around you remains unchanged for long stretches of time. The same rocks, the same slope of pale debris, the same distant line of cliffs that seem never to come any closer. Then, without noticing the transition, you realize that the cliffs are suddenly nearer, their immense faces rising in layered bands of sedimentary rock that tilt slightly from the horizontal. You can see the individual strata now, some thick and pale, others thin and dark, running in parallel lines across the entire height like the pages of a stone book. The path begins to climb, a gradual upward slope that leads away from the flat gravel plain and into the foothills of the escarpment. Your breathing deepens slightly, adjusting to the incline, but you maintain the same steady pace, one sandal placed deliberately before the other. The track winds between large boulders the color of old bone, some of them as tall as a man, their surfaces pitted and smoothed by centuries of wind-blown sand. You pass a dry stream bed that cuts across the path, a shallow gully filled with rounded stones that have not felt water in living memory. The stones are bleached almost white on their upper surfaces and stained a faint rusty brown where they touch the ground. You step down into the gully, feeling the loose stones shift under your weight, then up the other side, and you continue on without pause. The walls of the valley are closing in now, the open expanse behind you giving way to a more enclosed landscape of twisting turns and hidden corners. The heat reflects off the rock surfaces, radiating from every direction so that the air shimmers slightly in the distance, a wavering distortion that makes the cliffs ahead seem to ripple. You pull a corner of your headcloth forward to shade your eyes and keep walking. Around a bend, the path straightens, and you see the entrance to the Valley of the Kings open before you. It is a wide cut between two massive cliffs, a natural gateway that leads into the heart of the necropolis. The floor of the valley beyond is a broad, flat expanse of pale rock and rubble, hemmed in on all sides by towering walls of limestone that rise several hundred feet into the glaring sky. From this distance, you can see the dark openings of several tombs dotted along the base of the cliffs, some of them small and unassuming, others larger and marked by heaps of excavated stone that fan out in great fans of pale debris. A few tombs have simple wooden barriers erected in front of their entrances, rough planks lashed together with rope, while others remain open, their dark mouths leading into the unseen interior. In one place, a group of workers is visible, tiny figures at this distance, moving slowly around a fresh debris pile as they carry baskets of stone out of a new cutting. The sound of their work does not reach you, but you can see the faint puff of dust rising from their activity, a thin haze that catches the light before dispersing. The valley is a place of profound quiet, a deep enveloping silence that seems to press in from the cliffs themselves, broken only by the occasional distant chink of a metal tool striking stone. You follow the path as it descends slightly into the valley floor. The group of painters spreads out a little now, each person finding their own route through the scattered stones. Your sandals crunch softly on the loose gravel, and you notice how the sound echoes faintly off the nearby cliff face, a small, flat repetition that dies away immediately. The heat inside the valley is more intense than on the open plain, trapped by the high walls and radiating back from every stone surface. Yet you do not feel discomfort so much as a heavy, drowsy warmth that slows your thoughts and makes the world seem very far away. You pass close to one of the tomb entrances, a dark rectangle cut neatly into the base of the cliff, and you feel the cool air that breathes from it as you walk by. A fleeting touch of dampness against your cheek that is gone as soon as you pass. The smell that comes from the opening is the smell of old stone and lamp, soot, and the faint sweetness of plaster drying somewhere deep inside. You do not stop. This is not your tomb. Your destination is a little farther on, part way up a gentle slope on the northern side of the valley. You see it now, the scribe's tomb, a modest entrance framed by a low mound of excavated limestone chips that have been dumped to one side in a neat, sloping pile. The stone around the opening's been cut smooth and square, and above the doorway there is a small, unfinished cartouche that has been roughed out but not yet carved. A simple wooden barrier stands to one side, propped open with a stone, and a coil of rope lies on the ground near the threshold. As you approach, you can feel the cool air flowing steadily out of the entrance, a constant exhalation that carries the same scent of damp plaster and lamp oil, along with a deeper, earthier smell of the living rock itself. You pause at the entrance for a moment, letting your eyes adjust from the bright sun to the darkness within. The other painters are arriving behind you, their footsteps slowing as they gather near the doorway. No one speaks. There is only the quiet shuffle of feet and the soft thump of bags being set down on the ground. You step over the threshold and the sunlight disappears. It is a sudden and complete transition, as if a curtain has been drawn across the world. The darkness is not absolute at first. Your eyes, still full of the glare of noon, see nothing but a deep, reddish black that swims with phantom shapes. You stand still, one hand resting lightly on the cool stone of the wall, and you wait for your vision to adjust. The air inside is remarkably cool, a dry, constant coolness that seems to rise from deep within the earth, and it wraps around your heated skin with a gentleness that is almost soothing. The smell of the tomb is richer here, damp plaster mixed with chopped straw, the faint acrid tang of burning oil from the lamps that wait inside, and underneath it, all the clean, mineral scent of the limestone that has been cut and chiseled into this hollow space. Your eyes begin to make out shapes, the walls of the corridor pale and smooth, the floor sloping gently downward, the faint golden glow of lamplight somewhere ahead. You move forward slowly, your sandals making a soft brushing sound on the plaster-dusted floor. The corridor descends at a gentle angle, just enough that you feel a slight pull in your calves as you walk. Niches have been cut into the walls at regular intervals, and in each niche a small oil lamp sits in a shallow dish of clay, its flame a steady, upright tongue of orange light that wavers only slightly in the faint breath of air that moves through the passage. The light these lamps give is soft and limited, casting long shadows that slide along the walls as you pass. The walls themselves have already been coated with a smooth layer of plaster, a mixture of gypsum and chopped straw, that has been troweled flat and then burnished to a dull sheen. The plaster is pale grey in the lamplight, almost white where the flame falls directly upon it, and darker grey in the recesses. It still carries a faint coolness to the touch, not fully cured, and it gives off that faint, sweet smell that you associate with new work. Your fingers brush the surface as you walk, feeling the slight grain of the straw fibers embedded in the plaster, the tiny irregularities that will disappear under layers of paint. The corridor opens into a chamber after perhaps 30 paces. The ceiling here is just high enough to stand upright, a flat plane of plaster that reflects the lamplight in a soft, diffuse glow. The space is rectangular, perhaps 12 paces long and 8 wide, and 3 of its walls have been fully plastered and prepared. The fourth wall, the one you entered through, is bare rock, rough with chisel marks that show the direction of the stonecutter's work. You can hear the distant tap of a chisel somewhere deeper in the tomb, a faint, rhythmic clinking that echoes through the stone. The stonecutters are still working, opening a second chamber beyond this one, but their noise is far away and muffled by the intervening rock, reduced to a gentle, persistent pulse that is more felt than heard. The chamber you stand in is yours for the day. The walls show a grid of red lines that has been carefully laid out, a net of horizontal and vertical chords snapped in ochre powder by the outline scribe. The lines divide the plaster into neat squares, each one perhaps the width of a hand, and within this grid the first faint outlines of the harvest scene are already visible. You can make out the seated figure of the tomb owner, the offering table before him, the row of workers bending to cut grain, the oxen standing in profile with their legs aligned. All of it is drawn in a thin wash of red, the lines delicate and precise. The colors in your bag will fill these empty shapes, bringing them into the solid flat world of the painted wall. You find the spot on the south wall where you were working yesterday, a section of the harvest scene showing the lower part of the oxen and the edge of the field, and you see that the plaster has dried perfectly overnight, ready for the next layer. The lamplight flickers once, a gentle pulse, and you set your bag down on the floor to begin. You set your bag down on the floor of the chamber, the soft thump absorbed by the thick layer of plaster dust that has settled over the stone. The lamp in its niche flickers once, a brief shiver of light, and then steadies again into a calm, upright flame that casts a warm circle of gold on the south wall. Before you can paint, the wall must be just right. You step closer and let your eyes travel slowly across the prepared plaster surface, scanning it inch by inch in the wavering lamplight. The plaster is a pale, worn grey, the color of dried river silt, and it holds a faint coolness that you can feel radiating gently against your face as you lean in. It is mostly dry now, having cured overnight in the still, dry air of the tomb, but it still retains a slight cool dampness deep within, a memory of the water that was mixed into the gypsum powder when the plasterers troweled it onto the rough stone. The surface is smooth in a general way, but you know from long experience that the eye alone is not enough to judge its readiness. Tiny grains of sand and fine straw fibers can rise just above the surface, almost invisible, and these will catch the tip of a brush later and drag lines of color out of true. You reach into your shoulder bag and take out a flat piece of smooth wood, a small float about the length of your hand, its edges worn round from use, its face polished to a silky texture by years of sliding over wet plaster. You hold it lightly between your fingers and bring it up to the wall, touching it to the plaster at the upper left corner of your section. You begin to run the wooden float slowly over the surface, moving it in a straight horizontal line from left to right. The wood glides with a faint, dry whisper, a sound so soft it is barely more than a breath. Your hand moves with a practiced steadiness, keeping the float flat so that its entire face is in contact with the plaster. As it travels, you feel the texture through your fingertips, the subtle vibrations that tell you everything you need to know. Most of the surface is smooth as polished stone, the float sliding without resistance, but here and there you detect a slight drag, a tiny irregularity that feels like a grain of sand under the wood. At these places you stop and run the float back over the spot a second time, a third time, feeling the minute roughness with your full attention. It is a patient kind of work, this checking, and you do not rush it. You move the float down an inch and trace another horizontal line, overlapping the first slightly, then another, until you have covered a band the width of your shoulders. The lamp flame hisses softly, a continuous faint sound like a tiny breath, and in the distance, the stonecutter's chisels tap out their slow, rhythmic pulse through the rock. You pause once to rub your thumb across the float's face, clearing away a fine dust that has accumulated, and then you continue downward, line by careful line, mapping the entire surface of the wall in your mind as a texture of smoothness and subtle grain. Where you find a slight roughness, you stop and reach for a small linen cloth that you have tucked into your belt. You pour a few drops of water from the flask in your bag onto the cloth, just enough to dampen it without making it wet, and you wring it out lightly between your fingers. Then you bring the damp cloth to the rough spot on the plaster and begin to pass it in slow, even circles, no larger than the width of your palm. The water soaks into the plaster instantly, darkening it to a soft tan, and the gentle friction of the cloth wears down the tiny raised grain. The motion is small and precise, your wrist rotating steadily, and you watch the plaster's color shift back to pale gray as the water evaporates, leaving the surface subtly smoother than before. You repeat the circular wiping several times, each pass overlapping the last, blending the texture until you can no longer feel any difference under your fingertips when you test it with the float. The sensation is of silk, of a river stone worn smooth by centuries of flowing water, a surface so even that it seems almost liquid in the lamplight. You move on to the next rough patch and do the same thing, dampening the cloth again when it begins to dry, always working in those small, patient circles. Around you, the other painters are doing the same on their assigned sections of the chamber walls, each one bent close to the plaster, each one moving a cloth or a float in slow, repetitive arcs. The chamber fills with a soft shushing sound, a low, diffuse whisper that seems to come from every direction at once, blending into a gentle, drowsy hum. It is a quiet sound, not loud enough to mask the hiss of the lamps or the distant chisel taps, but it adds a new layer to the stillness, a texture of gentle labor that soothes rather than disturbs. After some time, you have gone over your entire section, smoothing the last tiny roughness near the lower right corner where the plaster meets the floor. You step back and look at the wall as a whole, and it appears flawless in the lamplight, a seamless expanse of pale plaster that seems to glow faintly with its own inner light. The grid lines that were snapped on the previous day are still faintly visible, pale red lines that cross the surface in a neat net, but they are ghostly now, partially obscured by the smoothing work. You know that the outline scribe will have to renew them before the next stage begins. You wipe your hands on the dry part of the linen cloth and place the float back into your bag, then stretch your arms slowly above your head, feeling the slight tightness in your shoulders from holding the same position for so long. The air in the chamber is cool and dry, smelling of the clean mineral scent of plaster and the faint, acrid note of lamp oil. It is a smell you know as well as the smell of your own house, a smell that means work and quiet and the steady passage of hours underground. You take a drink of water from your flask, letting the cool liquid rest in your mouth for a moment before swallowing, and then you wait for the outline scribe to come. He arrives after a short while, stepping into the chamber from the corridor with his tools in hand. He is a thin man with careful, deliberate movements, and he does not speak as he enters. In one hand he carries a small wooden bowl containing a paste of red ochre mixed with water, its surface glossy and dark. In the other hand, he holds a length of thin cord made from twisted flax fibers, coiled loosely around his fingers. He also has a small weight, a pear-shaped piece of stone with a hole drilled through its narrow end, through which the cord is threaded. He nods once to the room in general, and then he moves to the south wall, to the section you have just smoothed. You step aside to give him room, and you watch as he sets the bowl of ochre paste on the floor beside his foot. He takes the loose end of the cord and dips it into the bowl, pressing it down with his thumb so that the fibers soak up the red liquid. He draws the cord slowly through his fingers, squeezing out the excess paste, leaving it evenly coated and glistening a deep, wet crimson. The smell of the ochre is faint and earthy, like dry clay after a rain that never came. The scribe moves to the far left edge of the wall, where the plaster meets the rough stone of the doorway. He has already placed small, nearly invisible pinpricks in the plaster at precise intervals, marks that he made when the plaster was still slightly soft. These marks serve as reference points for the grid. He holds the cord against the wall, aligning it with two of these pinpricks, one near the top of the wall and one near the bottom, so the cord runs perfectly vertical. He pulls it taut with one hand, his knuckles whitening slightly with the tension, and with the other hand he takes hold of the cord about halfway down its length. He pulls it away from the wall by a finger's width, and then he releases it with a quick, precise motion. The cord snaps back against the plaster with a soft, sharp sound, a little thwack that echoes briefly in the confined space, and it leaves behind a perfectly straight vertical line of red ochre, thin as a thread, running from the ceiling to the floor. The line is clean and unbroken, the color bright against the pale plaster, and the scribe studies it for a moment before moving to the next set of marks. He repeats the process again and again, moving steadily across the wall from left to right, dipping the cord into the ochre paste each time to refresh the color, stretching it between the pinpricks, plucking it with that same precise snap. Each time a new vertical line appears, parallel to the last, spaced with an exactness that comes from long practice. The red lines stand out against the plaster, like the strings of a musical instrument, taut and ordered, dividing the wall into tall, narrow columns. When he has finished the vertical lines, the scribe moves to the horizontal ones. He changes his position, now working from the top of the wall downward, using a different set of pinpricks that mark the horizontal divisions. The cord is stretched from left to right this time, pulled tight between two marks on opposite sides of the wall, and he plucks it in the same way. The horizontal lines cross the vertical ones at right angles, each intersection forming a neat square of red lines, and gradually the entire wall is covered with a perfect grid. There are 18 rows from top to bottom and an equal number of columns from side to side, so that the wall is divided into 324 squares of equal size, each one a little smaller than the palm of a hand. The grid is a thing of quiet beauty, a mathematical net that imposes order on the blank plaster, and you stand looking at it with a calm, quiet appreciation. The red lines are faint but perfectly clear, and they shimmer slightly in the lamplight as the ochre paste slowly dries, shifting from a wet crimson to a matte dusky red. The grid determines every proportion of the finished painting. You know that the seated figure of the tomb owner will occupy a space 18 squares high, from the baseline to the top of his head, with his knees at the 6th square and his waist at the 10th. His shoulders will span 6 squares across, his head 2 squares in height, his eye placed exactly 1 square back from the front of the face according to the canon that has been passed down through generations of painters. The workers in the field will be smaller, their figures reduced to 12 squares in height, their bodies bent in the same pose across the entire row. The oxen will occupy a horizontal band 8 squares tall, their legs perfectly straight and their hooves all resting on the same baseline. Even the offering table and the jars of wine and the piles of bread will fit neatly into the squares, their sizes and positions predetermined by the grid's silent geometry. You study the lines quietly, moving your eyes from square to square, counting the rows and columns, visualizing the scene that will soon fill this empty space. You can already see where the offering table will go, a low rectangular shape occupying the central squares in the lower half of the wall, flanked by the seated figure on the left and the standing servants on the right. You can see where the row of tall wine jars will be painted, each jar 2 squares wide and 4 squares tall, their pointed bases resting on a register line that runs horizontally across the 15th row. The grid holds all of this in potential, a silent blueprint that waits for the first touch of the brush. You stand there for a long moment, letting your mind settle into the quiet order of the squares. The silence in the tomb is deep, a profound absence of sound that seems almost like a presence in itself. The only breaks in the stillness are the faint hiss of the lamp flame, the occasional soft cough of another painter somewhere in the chamber, and the distant, rhythmic tap of the stonecutter's chisels, which has become so regular that it fades into the background like a heartbeat. The air remains cool and dry, smelling of plaster dust and mineral pigments and the faint, sweet scent of the gum arabic that waits in the stoppered jars. You take up your palette of colors from your bag and set it on a flat stone near the wall, arranging the small pots in the order you will use them: green for the fields and the offerings, red-brown for the skin of the workers, white for the kilts, blue for the background, black for the fine outlines. You select your finest brush, the one with the reed stem and the carefully shaped tip, and you dip it into the pot of thin red ochre wash that you will use for the first outlines. The brush rests in your hand with a familiar lightness, and you turn toward the wall, toward the grid that waits with its silent, patient squares. The day's painting is about to begin. You take up your finest brush, the one with the reed stem cut to a slender point and the bristles shaped to a needle-fine tip that holds just the right amount of liquid, and you dip it into the small pot of thin red ochre wash. The color is a translucent, watery red, the same hue as the grid lines on the wall, but slightly darker, and it flows into the brush with a faint, sucking sound as the fibers drink. You wipe the excess gently against the rim of the pot, turning the brush in your fingers so that the tip comes to a perfect point, and then you turn to face the south wall where the grid waits in its pale, silent geometry. The lamp flame behind you casts your shadow onto the plaster, a soft-edged dark shape that falls across the squares without disturbing their order. You begin at the top left corner of your section, where the highest horizontal line meets the first vertical, and you touch the brush to the intersection with a light, deliberate pressure. The red ochre blooms onto the plaster, a small dot of color that marks the starting point, and from there you draw the brush downward along the vertical line in one slow, continuous stroke. The line darkens under your hand, the faint original chord mark becoming a crisp, solid boundary that glistens wetly for a moment before the plaster begins to drink the moisture, leaving a matte red thread that is perfectly straight and even. You move to the next vertical line and repeat the motion, drawing the brush from top to bottom with the same unhurried pace, your wrist gliding in a steady descent that requires no thought, only the quiet attention of long practice. Then you turn the brush horizontally and begin to trace the lines that run from left to right, each one a smooth, level stroke that crosses the verticals at exact right angles, reinforcing the grid into a darker, more secure framework that will hold the entire scene within its measured bounds. The work is silent except for the faint drag of the brush tip on the plaster, a whisper so soft it barely registers, and the occasional tiny drip of excess wash falling from the brush into the pot with a sound like a single drop of rain. When the grid lines have all been darkened, you pause and dip the brush again, then wipe it lightly on the linen cloth to remove any excess that might blob at the tip. The wall is now a net of clean red lines, each square defined and ready, and you let your eyes travel across the grid, from top to bottom, left to right, counting the rows silently in your mind. The proportions are already set by the canon that governs all such paintings. The seated figure of the two-moner will rise 18 squares from the baseline, his body arranged so that the waist aligns with the 10th row, the knees with the 6th, the top of the head with the 18th. You've painted this figure so many times in so many tombs that your hand knows the measurements without your conscious mind needing to recall them. A deep bodily memory that lives in the flex of your fingers and the angle of your wrist. You begin to sketch the overseer at the left side of the scene, starting with the baseline that runs across the 14th row, a line that will serve as the ground on which all the figures stand. You draw a short horizontal stroke just above this baseline, marking the position of the overseer's feet, two small shapes that point in the same direction according to the convention that shows both feet from the side. Then you move upward, counting squares, and sketch the line of his calf, the slight curve of his knee at the 6th square, the straight, stiff line of his thigh that rises to the hip. Your brush moves with small, deliberate strokes, each one placed exactly where the grid dictates, no hurry and no variation. The overseer's kilt falls from his waist in a series of straight pleats that follow the vertical lines of the grid, each pleat a single downward stroke of the brush, parallel and evenly spaced, the hem of the kilt stopping precisely at the 7th row. You draw his torso next, the shoulders spanning exactly 4 squares across, the chest a smooth, flat plane marked only by a small nipple drawn as a circle in the appropriate square. His neck rises 2 squares from the shoulders, a straight column that supports the head, and you sketch the head in profile according to the unchanging rule. The brow and nose form a single continuous line that descends from the top of the forehead to the tip of the nostril. The lips are 2 small bumps, the chin a soft curve that recedes slightly, and the eye is drawn as though seen from the front, a single almond shape with a black pupil in its center, set exactly 1 square back from the bridge of the nose. The overseer's arm is raised, and you draw the line of his shoulder joint at the top of the torso, then the upper arm descending at a slight angle across 3 squares, the elbow bending at a precise point marked by the grid, the forearm rising again with the hand holding a long staff. The fingers wrap around the staff in the stylized way that you've drawn 1,000 times, each finger a small parallel line that curves just enough to suggest a grip. The staff itself is a straight vertical line that runs from the overseer's hand down to the baseline, passing through several squares in a single unbroken stroke. You step back for a moment, tilting your head, and you see that the overseer is now present on the wall in faint red outline, his proportions correct, his pose formal and still. The red lines are faint but entirely clear, a ghost image that waits for the solid colors to come. You move to the next section of the wall, where the oxen will stand in the field. The grid here continues seamlessly, and you find the baseline that the oxen will share with the overseer, a single horizontal thread that unites the entire scene. You begin with the first ox, placing its hooves directly on the baseline of the appropriate squares, 4 small rectangles that touch the line with their flat bottoms. The legs rise from the hooves in straight columns, each leg exactly 1 square wide, the joints marked by small angled lines at the knees that follow the diagonal of the grid. The body of the ox is a long horizontal oval that spans 8 squares from chest to rump, its belly a gentle curve that dips slightly below the midline, its back a straighter line that rises toward the shoulders. You draw the neck extending forward and upward at an angle, the head held low, the muzzle a square shape with a single line for the mouth, and the horns sweeping upward in a smooth arc that you have practiced so often your brush seems to find the curve by itself, a long crescent that starts at the forehead and curves back toward the shoulders. The second ox stands beside the first, its body overlapping slightly in the way that indicates depth without perspective, and you draw it with the same measured strokes, hooves on the baseline, straight legs, oval body, lowered head, curved horns. The 2 animals are nearly identical, their poses repeated without variation, because the purpose of the painting is not to show individual animals, but to show the idea of oxen, the eternal form of oxen ploughing the eternal field. You work your way along the wall, sketching the simple harness that links the oxen to the plough, a few straight lines and small loops drawn in the squares that lie between the animals and the ground. The plough itself is a simple shape, a long wooden shaft with a curved handle at the back and a pointed blade at the front, and you place it precisely on the grid line that marks the earth. The lamp sputters once, a brief flicker that makes the shadows jump, and you pause with the brush held motionless above the plaster. An apprentice moves quietly past, his bare feet making no sound on the stone floor, and he lifts the lamp from its niche with careful hands. He uses a small bronze tool to trim the wick, cutting away the charred tip, and then he adds a few drops of oil from a small pottery flask, tilting it slowly so that the oil runs down the side into the reservoir. The flame steadies, brightening slightly, and the apprentice replaces the lamp in its niche and moves away without a word. You wait until the light is steady again, and then you resume your work, the brief interruption already forgotten. You continue with the harvest workers, a row of small figures that occupy the lower registers of the wall below the oxen. These figures are smaller than the overseer, only 12 squares in height, according to the canon, and they are bent forward at the waist in the pose of cutting grain. You draw the first worker starting at the baseline, placing his feet in their conventional side-by-side position, the back foot slightly raised as if stepping forward. The line of his calf rises to the bent knee, and from there, the thigh angles forward into the hip. The torso bends at the waist, a sharp angle that follows the diagonal of the grid, and you draw the spine as a single curved line that runs from the hips to the shoulders. The head is lowered, the face in profile, and you sketch the same conventional features, the continuous line of brow and nose, the small lips, the single eye visible as an almond shape with a pupil. The worker's arms extend forward, the hands gripping the curved blade of a sickle, a simple crescent shape that you draw with 2 quick strokes. The grain itself rises in front of the worker, a series of tall, straight stems that you indicate with vertical lines, their tops bending slightly under the weight of the seed heads, which you draw as small, clustered ovals. The second worker stands beside the first in an identical pose, and the third beside the second, and so on across the entire width of the wall, a slow procession of bent backs and reaching arms and curved sickles, each figure a repetition of the one before. The repetition is calming, a gentle, undemanding rhythm that allows your mind to drift into a quiet, half-aware state while your hand continues its steady progress. You are not bored exactly. Rather, you are absorbed in a state that lies somewhere between sleep and waking, a place where time softens and the only reality is the brush in your fingers and the red line unspooling onto the plaster. When the workers are complete, you step back from the wall and let your gaze travel across the whole scene. The grid is still visible behind the red outlines, a faint net that holds everything in its measured embrace, and the figures stand quietly in their squares, waiting for the color that will fill them. The overseer with his raised staff, the oxen with their curved horns, the bent workers with their sickles, all of them are present now in thin red lines, a complete world drawn on the plaster in a single color. You notice a few small irregularities, places where a line has wobbled slightly or a curve is not as smooth as it could be, and you step forward again to correct them. You use the tip of the brush to redraw a knee joint, to smooth the arc of a horn, to straighten the hem of the overseer's kilt, each correction a tiny, precise adjustment that brings the outline closer to the ideal. The work of correction is as slow and careful as the original drawing, and you lose yourself in it just as completely, your brush moving in small, exact strokes, while the lamp burns steadily and the stonecutter's distant tapping continues its slow, unvarying pulse through the rock. At last you are satisfied, and you set the brush down across the rim of the ochre pot, flexing your fingers to ease the slight cramp that has settled into them from holding the brush for so long. The chamber around you is quiet. The other painters still bent over their own sections, their shadows moving gently on the walls. The red outlines on your section are complete, a ghost of the harvest scene drawn in careful, unhurried strokes that have taken the entire morning to place. You look at the wall for a long moment, not thinking anything in particular, simply letting your eyes rest on the lines you have made, and then you turn to prepare the next set of brushes and the pots of base color that will begin to bring the scene to life. You clean the fine brush that you used for the red outlines by dipping it into a small cup of water and working the bristles gently between your thumb and forefinger, watching the faint pink tint spread through the water as the last traces of ochre dissolve away. You stroke the brush against the rim of the cup to remove the excess moisture, then shape the tip by rolling it lightly on a dry corner of the linen cloth, and you set it aside in your bag where it will stay clean until it is needed again for the final detailing. From the row of brushes laid out on the flat stone beside your palette, you now select a thicker one, a brush with a broader reed stem and a wider spread of bristles that has been cut flat across the tip rather than pointed, a tool designed for laying in broad areas of color rather than fine lines. The handle is smooth and warm from the ambient heat of the chamber, and it rests in your fingers with the easy familiarity of something held many thousands of times. You take up the pot of Egyptian blue, which you had ground fresh that morning in the workshop courtyard, and you remove the small flat piece of pottery that serves as its lid, setting it aside on the stone. The blue paste inside is smooth and thick, with a consistency like softened beeswax, and its color in the lamplight is a deep, vivid blue that seems almost to vibrate against the pale plaster of the wall. You stir it once with a short blunt stick to ensure that the pigment and the gum binder are thoroughly mixed, the stick moving in slow, lazy circles that leave faint trails on the surface of the paste before they close over and disappear. You begin with the background, the broad expanse of blue that will frame the entire scene and set the figures apart from the bare plaster. The blue field occupies the upper portion of the wall above the heads of the figures, and it extends downward in narrow vertical strips between the bodies of the workers, filling every space that is not occupied by a figure or an object. You dip the broad brush into the blue paste, drawing the bristles through the surface so that they take up an even load of color, and you wipe one side of the brush gently against the inner rim of the pot to prevent any dripping. Then you raise the brush to the wall and touch it to the plaster at the upper left corner of the background area, where the top horizontal grid line meets the first vertical line. You press lightly, and the blue transfers from the bristles to the plaster in a smooth, opaque stroke about the width of 2 fingers. The plaster drinks the moisture from the paint almost immediately, so that the wet gleam fades within a heartbeat to a soft, matte finish, the color settling into the surface as though it had always been there. You draw the brush downward in a slow, steady stroke, keeping the pressure even so that the line of blue remains uniform in width and density. When you reach the bottom of the background area, where the blue meets the baseline of the scene, you lift the brush carefully and move it back to the top to begin the next stroke, overlapping the edge of the first one by a tiny margin so that no plaster shows through between them. The motion is rhythmic and repetitive. Dip the brush into the pot, wipe the excess on the rim, place the bristles at the top of the wall, draw downward with a steady hand, lift to the bottom, and return to the top. Dip, wipe, stroke, lift, return. 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 The cycle repeats itself again and again, and your breathing slows to match the pace of your hand, each exhalation coinciding with the downward stroke, each inhalation with the return. The blue spreads gradually across the wall, a slow tide that advances from left to right, covering the plaster square by square. The color is rich and even, a deep celestial blue that reminds you of the sky at twilight just after the sun has disappeared, when the world is suspended between day and night. It is the same blue that you have painted on the walls of a dozen tombs before this one, the same blue that will frame the harvest scene and set off the warm ochres and browns of the figures, and you apply it with the same calm, unhurried attention that you give to every task in this quiet space. The lamp flame hisses softly, a continuous faint sound that you have long since stopped noticing, and the distant chisel taps continue their slow, rhythmic pulse through the stone, a heartbeat that measures the hours without urgency. After some time, the upper background is completely covered, a wide band of blue that stretches across the entire width of your section from left to right. You pause to stretch your fingers, which have begun to feel slightly stiff from holding the brush, and you step back a pace to examine the surface. The blue is uniform and opaque, showing no streaks or thin patches, and it has dried to a perfectly matte surface that seems to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. Satisfied, you dip the brush again and begin to fill the narrow vertical strips of background that run between the figures in the lower part of the scene, the spaces between the overseer's staff and the oxen, the gaps between the bent backs of the harvest workers. These spaces require a slightly smaller brush movement, shorter strokes that follow the contours of the red outlines, and you adjust the angle of your hand accordingly, tilting the brush so that only the very tip touches the plaster in the tightest corners. You work slowly, carefully, keeping the blue within its boundaries, and the red outlines that you drew earlier seem to guide your hand as naturally as a channel guides water. When the blue is finished, you set the pot aside and place the broad brush into your cup of water to soak. The water immediately turns a pale milky blue, and you swirl the brush gently before lifting it out and wiping it on the linen cloth until the bristles show no trace of color. You select a second broad brush, this one reserved for the green, and you take up the pot of malachite green that you had ground so carefully in the morning. Its paste, the color of young papyrus, shoots after the flood. The green will fill the band of crops that runs behind the harvest workers, a horizontal strip of color that represents the fields of grain waiting to be cut, a stripe of fertility that stretches across the scene just above the baseline. You stir the green paste with a blunt stick, feeling its slightly gritty texture as it yields to the pressure, and then you load the brush and begin to apply it to the wall. The green goes on in a series of horizontal strokes this time, because the band of crops runs from left to right, and you draw the brush along the grid line that marks the top of the crop field. A single long stroke that establishes the upper boundary. Then you work downward, row by row, filling the space between the upper boundary and the baseline with solid green, each stroke overlapping the last by a hair's breadth so that the color is continuous and unbroken. The green is a softer, earthier color than the blue, a warm green that leans slightly toward brown in the lamplight, and as it spreads across the wall it seems to bring a quiet sense of life to the scene, a whisper of the growing things that the harvest will cut. You notice how the green changes the visual weight of the wall, anchoring the lower portion and providing a foundation for the figures that will be painted over it. The work continues in the same steady rhythm, your hand moving back and forth along the horizontal lines, the brush depositing its load of color in smooth, even strokes that never vary in width or pressure. After the green comes the brown for the oxen, a warm reddish brown made from red ochre mixed with a touch of charcoal black, and you switch to a medium brush that is neither as broad as the background brushes nor as fine as the outlining brush, a versatile tool that can cover the broad flanks of the animals while still allowing you to stay within the red outlines. You load the brush and begin with the first ox, filling the large oval of its body with solid brown, drawing the brush along the curved outline of the back, and then filling the interior with shorter, overlapping strokes that follow the contour of the animal's form. The brown goes on smoothly, covering the plaster completely, and as it dries, it takes on a soft, velvety appearance that seems to give the oxen a subtle weight and presence. You move from the first ox to the second, repeating the process, and then you fill in the legs, which are thinner and require a lighter touch. The brush held nearly vertical, so that only the very tip deposits color within the narrow outlines. The hooves you leave unpainted for now, because they will be black, and the eyes you also leave for the fine detail work later. The brown covers the oxen's bodies completely, transforming them from faint red ghosts into solid, earth-colored creatures that stand quietly in their eternal field. Next you take up the pot of red-brown that will color the skin of the male workers, a darker, richer shade than the oxen's brown, made from red ochre with only a small amount of black added. You stir it well and load the medium brush, and then you begin to fill the figures of the overseer and the harvest workers. The overseer's body receives the color first, his chest and arms and legs painted in careful strokes that follow the red outlines exactly, the brush moving from shoulder to wrist, from hip to ankle, covering the skin areas with an even layer of red-brown. The face you fill in more delicately, using the tip of the brush to work around the single eye and the small lips, leaving those features as unpainted plaster that will receive their own colors later. The overseer's hands are small and stylized, each one a cluster of fine outlines that you fill with tiny, precise dabs of the brush, the color barely more than a touch on the plaster. When the overseer is complete, you move to the harvest workers, who are smaller figures requiring a correspondingly smaller amount of color, and you paint their bent backs and reaching arms with the same careful attention, each figure receiving the same red-brown skin, the same even coverage, the same patient filling of the outlines. The female figures among the workers, those who are binding the sheaves behind the cutters, receive a lighter shade, a yellow-brown that you mix on the spot by adding a small amount of white to the red-brown and stirring it with the blunt stick until the color is a warm, sandy tone that the canon prescribes for women's skin. You apply it with the same steady hand, and the figures gradually take on their proper identities, male and female distinguished by the ancient convention of color, standing together in their eternal labor. The white for the kilts comes next, a dense, chalky paste made from gypsum that covers the lower bodies of the figures in a clean, bright layer that contrasts sharply with the darker skin tones. Use a clean medium brush for the white, because any trace of another color would muddy its purity, and you load it carefully from the pot, making sure the paste is thick enough to provide solid coverage without becoming so thick that it cracks when it dries. The overseer's kilt is painted in a series of vertical strokes that follow the pleats you drew in the outline stage, each stroke a single straight line of white that runs from the waist to the hem. The workers' kilts are simpler, smaller rectangles of white that you fill in with 2 or 3 quick strokes, leaving the edges clean and straight. The white dries quickly, its surface slightly chalky to the eye, and it brightens the entire scene, providing a visual anchor that draws the gaze back to the figures again and again. Time passes without measure inside the tomb. You are aware only of the wall in front of you, the smell of gum binder and plaster dust, the soft sound of your own breathing, and the steady, repetitive motion of your hand as it moves from pot to wall and back again. The lamp burns steadily now, its flame a constant golden presence at the edge of your vision, and the air remains cool and dry, scented faintly with the clean mineral smell of the colors you are applying. Sometimes you pause to set down your pot and stretch your fingers, working the stiffness out of the joints by flexing them slowly, and sometimes you take a small sip of water from the flask in your bag, letting the cool liquid rest in your mouth before swallowing. but mostly you paint, the broad colors spreading across the plaster in their quiet, orderly way. The red outlines filling with solid hues, the wall transforming from a line drawing into a world of flat, vibrant color that will endure in the darkness long after you have gone. With the base colors dry to a soft, matte finish that no longer shows any gleam of moisture, you take up the finest brush once more, the one with the reed stem so slender it bends slightly under the weight of your fingers and the bristles shaped to a point as sharp as a thorn. You dip it into the pot of charcoal black, a dense, light-drinking paste that you ground that morning until it was as fine as soot, and you wipe the tip carefully on the rim so that only the smallest bead of color clings to the very end of the brush. The overseer on the wall waits with his red-brown skin and his white kilt, his face still blank except for the faint red outline of his features, and you lean in close to the plaster, so close that you can smell the faint dusty scent of the dried pigment and feel the coolness of the wall radiating against your cheek. You touch the brush to the outline of the overseer's eye, that single almond shape that looks out from the profile with its pupil already marked by a dot of red, and you begin to trace the black line around it with a slowness that makes your hand move almost imperceptibly. The line must be perfectly even, neither too thick nor too thin, and it must follow the red outline exactly, reinforcing it with a dark, definitive edge that makes the eye stand out from the surrounding skin. Your fingers tighten just slightly on the reed stem to steady the brush, and you draw the line from the inner corner of the eye to the outer corner, a smooth, unbroken stroke that curves gently upward at the end, and then you continue the line past the outer corner into a short, straight extension that points toward the temple in the conventional way, the way that all eyes are drawn in all tombs, a mark that represents the cosmetic line that living people paint on their faces. The black line sits on the plaster with a crisp finality, and the overseer's face gains its burst detail, a small but essential piece of the whole. From the eye you move to the eyebrow, which you paint as a single dark line that arches above the eye and extends even farther toward the temple, parallel to the cosmetic line, a second stroke that you lay down with the same painstaking care. The black of the eyebrow meets the black of the eye's extension, and together they form a kind of frame that gives the profile a quiet intensity. You dip the brush again, wipe it, and then you paint the pupil of the eye as a solid black circle set within the almond shape, a small dot of darkness that seems to look out from the wall with a calm, eternal gaze. The overseer's face is nearly finished now, lacking only the red for the lips and the brown for the iris, which you will add later, and you pause to examine your work, tilting your head to one side and then the other, checking that the eye is placed in the correct square of the grid and that the lines are clean. Satisfied, you move on to the other figures in the scene, the workers and the servants and the women binding sheaves, and you paint their eyes one by one, each almond shape receiving its black outline and its dark pupil, each eyebrow arching in the same measured curve. The repetition is a form of meditation, your hand moving from face to face, brush dipping to pot and returning to wall, the same motion repeated for each figure, and the faces of the harvest scene gradually come alive with the quiet presence of their painted gazes. When the eyes and eyebrows are done, you clean the black from your brush by rinsing it in the cup of water and then wiping it on the linen cloth until no trace of color remains. You set the black pot aside and take up the one containing the red ochre, a warm, earthy red that you will use for the lips of the figures and for the small details of their jewelry. You touch the tip of the brush to the overseer's mouth, tracing the two small bumps of the lips that the red outline had indicated, filling them with a thin wash of red that gives the face a subtle warmth without overpowering the other features. You do the same for the other figures, each pair of lips receiving a small dab of red, and then you clean the brush again and turn your attention to the white kilt of the overseer, which is at present a solid field of gypsum white that needs only its pleat lines to be complete. You take up a slightly thicker brush, one that can hold a little more paint, and you load it with a very thin wash of pale grey made from a single drop of black mixed into a larger amount of white, a color that is barely more than a shadow. With this, you paint the fine vertical lines that suggest the folds of the linen kilt, drawing each line from the waistband down to the hem in a single smooth stroke that follows the grid lines exactly. The pleats are spaced evenly, each one a finger's width from the next, and you paint them one after the other, working from left to right, the brush rising and falling in a quiet rhythm that covers the white field with a pattern of delicate grey stripes. The kilt now has texture, a sense of fabric hanging in neat folds, and the overseer's figure looks more complete, more fully present on the wall. Next, you turn your attention to the jewelry, the broad collar necklace that the overseer wears around his neck, and the bracelets on his wrists. You dip your finest brush into the pot of yellow ochre, a golden color the shade of ripe wheat, and you begin to paint the individual beads of the collar. Each bead is a small dot of color, no larger than a grain of barley, and you place them one by one in neat rows that follow the curve of the collar as it spreads across the chest from shoulder to shoulder. The dots are all the same size, the same spacing, and you paint them with a patience that requires no thought, only the steady attention of your eye and the delicate control of your fingers. The yellow ochre stands out brightly against the red-brown skin, and after you have placed a full row of yellow beads, you switch to the red ochre and add a second row of red beads just below the first, alternating the colors to create a pattern that mimics the faience and carnelian jewelry of the living. The bracelets are simpler, small bands of yellow ochre and red that circle the wrists, and you paint them with 2 or 3 swift strokes, the brush turning slightly to follow the curve of the arm. The overseer is now fully adorned, his status marked by the richness of his painted ornaments, and you step back for a moment to see how he looks against the blue background and the green field of grain, a composed and dignified figure presiding over the eternal harvest. Your gaze shifts to the offering table that sits before the overseer, a low rectangular shape that you had filled earlier with a base coat of pale yellow. Now it is time to paint the objects that cover the tabletop, the loaves of bread and the jars of beer and the cuts of meat that the inscription will name as offerings for the deceased. You select a brush that is neither too fine nor too broad, and you dip it into the brown that you had mixed for the bread, a warm golden brown that you apply in small, neat ovals. Each loaf is a slightly curved cone shape, the traditional form of Egyptian bread, and you paint them in a row across the table, the ovals overlapping slightly so that they seem piled upon one another. Then you add small lines of darker brown to indicate the scald crust of the bread, 3 or 4 quick strokes on each loaf that give it a more solid, recognizable appearance. Beside the bread, you paint the beer jars, tall shapes with pointed bases and small handles near the rims, and you fill them in with a reddish-brown color that represents the clay of the jars themselves, leaving the rims unpainted so that they can be lined with black later. Each jar is identical to the one before it, the same height, the same width, the same placement in the grid, and you paint them with the same steady, repetitive motion that you have used for every detail so far. The offering table slowly fills with food and drink, a generous spread that will sustain the tomb-owner in the afterlife, and you add a few cuts of meat indicated by red ovals with white lines of fat, and some vegetables, onions and cucumbers painted in green and white, all of them arranged in neat rows that follow the grid's orderly logic. When the offering table is complete, you clean your brush and turn at last to the hieroglyphs that occupy the upper portion of the wall above the scene, the columns of text that spell out the offering formula and the names and titles of the deceased. The hieroglyphs were drawn in faint red outline by the scribe at the same time as the figures, each sign placed precisely within its column, each column separated from the next by a vertical line that you had reinforced earlier with red. Now you take up your finest brush and the pot of charcoal black, and you begin to paint the signs themselves. The first column reads from top to bottom, and you start with the topmost sign, a vulture that is drawn as a simple silhouette with a hooked beak and outspread wings that curve downward to the baseline. You fill the outline with solid black, painting the body of the bird first, then the head, then the wings, each part receiving its share of color until the whole sign is a dark, compact shape that stands out clearly against the pale plaster. Below the vulture, the next sign is a reed leaf, a tall, slender shape with a pointed tip and a short horizontal stroke near its base, and you paint it with the pot of green, switching brushes to keep the colors clean. The reed leaf taking shape as a bright, living green that speaks of the marshes and the papyrus thickets. Below the reed leaf is an owl, a small round-bodied bird with large eyes and tiny feet, and you paint it in black, giving it the same careful attention that you gave the vulture, the owl's form complete with its distinctive face and its wings folded against its sides. Then comes a waterline, a zigzag stroke of blue that you paint with the Egyptian blue, a quick, sharp line that represents the surface of the Nile, a sign that appears again and again in the text. You work down the column, sign by sign, each one requiring its own color, its own brush, its own moments of focused care, a basket in brown, a loaf of bread in yellow, a forearm in red-brown, a mouth in red, a quail chick in black, a viper in black, a sun disk in red. The columns of hieroglyphs are long, and the text is formulaic, the same offering prayer that you have painted in tomb after tomb, the same sequence of signs that you know so well your brush seems to find the shapes, without your mind needing to read the words. The meaning of the text is not your concern. Your concern is only the shapes, the clean edges, the even color, the proper spacing between signs so that the columns are balanced and harmonious. You paint the signs one after another, moving from column to column, the brush dipping into the pots and returning to the wall, the lamplight steady on the plaster, the air quiet and still. Occasionally the apprentice moves past to check the lamp, and the flame flickers for a moment as he adds a little more oil from his flask, tilting it carefully so that the liquid runs down the side without spilling, and then the light steadies again and you continue your work as if there had been no interruption at all. The signs accumulate under your brush, a dense, orderly script that fills the space above the harvest scene, and the whole wall now seems complete, in a way it was not before, the details bringing a richness and a precision that transform the broad areas of color into a finished work. You clean your brush one last time, wiping it gently on the linen cloth until no color comes off on the fabric, and you set it down beside the row of pigment pots. Your fingers are slightly stiff from the long hours of fine work, and you stretch them slowly, opening and closing your hand while you look at the wall with a quiet, wordless satisfaction. The figures and the offerings and the hieroglyphs, all present now, all finished, waiting in the lamplight for the day to end. A senior painter near the entrance of the chamber straightens up from his crouch and turns toward the rest of you with a slow, deliberate movement, his silhouette dark against the faint glow of daylight that seeps down the corridor from the world outside. He does not speak a word but simply raises one hand in a gesture that everyone recognizes, a small lifting of the palm that means the morning's work has reached its natural pause. Around you, the other painters begin to set down their brushes, the soft clicks of reed stems against pottery rims punctuating the quiet, and you do the same, laying your own brush across the top of your palette so that the painted tip rests in the air and does not touch any surface. You place the small piece of flat pottery back onto the pot of black to keep it from drying out, then cap the green and the blue and the white in the same careful way, each lid fitted snugly so that the paste beneath will remain workable through the afternoon. The stiffness in your shoulders makes itself known as you straighten up, a dull, warm ache that spreads down your back and into your neck from the long hours of leaning toward the wall, and you roll your shoulders slowly, once forward and once back, feeling the muscles lengthen and release in a way that is both uncomfortable and satisfying. The palette and pots you leave on the flat stone near the wall, arranged neatly so that you will find them exactly as you left them when you return, and you wipe your fingers on the linen cloth that has been tucked into your belt, the cloth now smudged with traces of red and black and blue that form an accidental pattern of overlapping stains. The group begins to move toward the corridor, a loose, unhurried procession of tired bodies in the dim lamplight, and you fall into step behind the others, your sandaled feet finding the familiar slope of the floor as it rises gently toward the entrance. The darkness around you is profound away from the lamps, the walls on either side reduced to rough, cool surfaces that you brush with your fingertips as you walk, a light touch that helps you keep your orientation in the gloom. The air grows warmer with each step, the deep chill of the inner chambers giving way to a milder coolness, and then, as you round the final bend to a breath of actual warmth that carries the dry, dusty scent of sun-heated rock. Ahead, the entrance appears as a bright rectangle of white gold light, so brilliant that it seems to burn at the edges, and the figures of the painters in front of you become dark cutouts against that glare, their bodies blocking the light in shifting silhouettes. You squint as you approach, your eyes accustomed to the dim amber of the oil lamps struggling to adjust to the sudden intensity, and by the time you step over the low threshold and out into the open air, you have to raise a hand to shield your face, the light pressing against your eyelids like a physical weight. The sun is a white glare directly overhead, a blinding disk in the sky that has bleached from morning blue to a pale, washed-out white, and the heat strikes you all at once, a heavy, silent pressure that wraps around your entire body. It is the kind of heat that makes the air itself feel thick, as if you were moving through something denser than atmosphere, and it carries the mineral smell of hot limestone and flint, a dry, clean scent that is so different from the damp plaster and lamp oil of the tomb. You stand still for a moment just outside the entrance, blinking rapidly as your pupils contract, and you feel the sweat that had dried on your skin in the cool chamber begin to prickle again along your hairline and at the small of your back. The other painters are doing the same, some of them stretching their arms above their heads, others shielding their eyes with cupped hands as they look out across the valley, and no one speaks because the heat seems to absorb sound, to press it down into the stones until nothing remains but a deep, humming silence. After a brief pause, the group begins to drift toward a familiar resting place, a patch of deep shade cast by a massive fallen boulder that lies about 50 paces from the tomb entrance along the base of the cliff. The boulder is an irregular block of limestone the size of a small house, its upper surface bleached nearly white by the sun, and its underside sloping inward to create a sheltered hollow where the ground is always cool. You walk toward it with the same slow, measured gait that you have kept all day, your sandals crunching softly on the loose gravel and the heat shimmering in the air around you, so that distant objects waver and dance. The valley stretches out to your left, a broad, flat expanse of pale rock and scattered debris that rises on all sides into towering cliffs, and the silence here is immense, a vast, empty quiet that seems to hold the entire world in a state of suspended stillness. A few other groups of workers are visible in the distance, small dark shapes moving slowly near other tomb entrances, but their sounds do not carry across the heated air, and they appear as silent as figures in a painting. You reach the shade of the fallen boulder and step into its shelter, and the dropping temperature is immediate and welcome. The rock above blocks the direct sun completely, leaving a space of soft grey shadow that feels almost cool by comparison with the glaring brightness beyond, and the ground here is packed earth rather than loose stone, worn smooth by the daily return of resting workers over many seasons. You find a flat stone that serves as a seat, one that you have sat on many times before, its surface worn to a slight concavity that fits the shape of your body, and you lower yourself onto it with a sigh that is barely more than an exhalation. Around you, the other painters are finding their own places, some on stones, some leaning back against the cool flank of the boulder itself, and the mood is quiet and restful, the kind of shared silence that needs no conversation to fill it. You reach into your shoulder bag and retrieve a small cloth bundle, its corners tied together with a length of twisted palm fiber, and you set it on your lap and begin to untie the knot with slow, patient fingers. The cloth falls open to reveal your midday meal, a piece of flat bread as wide as your hand, its surface pitted with small bubbles from the baking and its edges slightly singed, a strip of dried fish that has been cured with salt until it is stiff and leathery, a small handful of dark, wrinkled dates that glisten faintly with their own sugars, and a single small onion with papery brown skin that crackles as you touch it. You range these items on the cloth spread across your knees, taking your time, and you begin to eat with the same unhurried attention that you give to your painting. The bread you tear into small pieces, each one about the size of your thumb, and you chew them slowly, the texture dense and slightly gritty against your teeth, the flavor mild and nutty from the emmer wheat that the village women grind and bake each morning. You eat the bread piece by piece, not rushing, pausing between bites to look out across the valley where the heat waves shimmer above the pale stones, and the simple act of chewing feels restorative in a way that goes beyond mere hunger. After the bread, you turn to the dried fish, which you flake apart with your fingernails into thin, translucent strips that curl at the edges. The fish is salty and intensely savory, its flavor concentrated by the drying process into something almost sharp, and you place a small strip on your tongue and let it soften there before chewing, the salt drawing moisture from your mouth and making the next sip of water seem all the more desirable. A water skin is being passed around among the painters, a large goatskin bag with a wooden stopper, and when it reaches your hands, you pull the stopper free and raise the opening to your lips, tilting the skin so that a steady stream of water flows into your mouth. The water is slightly warm from the sun, with a faint taste of leather and an earthiness that comes from the well where it was drawn, and you drink deeply, feeling it wash the salt from your tongue and soothe the dryness in your throat that had accumulated during the morning's work. You pass the water skin to the painter seated beside you, a quiet man whose face is lined with the same deep wrinkles that come from years of squinting in lamplight, and he accepts it with a small nod before drinking his own share. The dates come next, their flesh soft and sticky between your fingers, and you eat them one at a time, pulling the sweet fruit away from the long narrow pit with your teeth and discarding the pits into a small pile at your feet. The sweetness coats your tongue and lingers there even after you swallow, a richness that contrasts with the plain bread and the salty fish, and it seems to give you a small burst of energy that spreads slowly through your limbs. The onion is the last thing you eat, a small, sharp bulb that you peel with careful movements, the papery skin floating away on the faint breeze that has begun to stir in the valley, and you bite into it as you would an apple, the pungent, sulphurous flavor bursting across your palate and clearing your senses in a way that is almost bracing. The onion's juice stings your lips slightly, but it is a clean, bright sensation that you have always enjoyed. And when you finish, you wipe your hands on the edge of the cloth and take another drink of water to wash away the lingering sharpness. The meal is finished now, the cloth empty except for a few crumbs and the pile of date pits, and you fold the cloth and tuck it back into your bag while the warmth of the food settles comfortably in your stomach. The valley before you remains unchanged, a vast bowl of pale stone and empty sky, and you let your gaze drift across it without focusing on any one thing. The heat shimmer rises from the rocks in invisible waves that make the far cliffs seem to ripple and dance, and the sky above is a uniform pale blue-white that offers no variation, no cloud, no bird. From somewhere in the distance, perhaps half a mile away on the other side of the valley, you can hear the faint rhythmic tap of a metal tool striking stone, a sound so attenuated by distance that it is barely more than a suggestion, a tiny pulse that you feel in your ears as much as hear. It is the same sound that follows you into the tomb each day, the constant backdrop of stonecutters opening new chambers, and it blends now with the deeper silence of the valley, adding a gentle texture to the stillness without disturbing it. You shift your position on the flat stone, leaning back until your shoulders come to rest against the cool, rough surface of the boulder behind you, and you feel the chill of the limestone seep slowly through the thin linen of your tunic, a pleasant coolness that spreads across your upper back and eases the lingering ache in your muscles. The shade you sit in is deep and complete, the boulders overhang blocking the sun so effectively that the ground beneath you has not felt direct light for countless years, and the air in this sheltered hollow carries a faint mineral dampness that reminds you of the tomb's interior, though it is much warmer and fresher. You close your eyes, letting the lids fall shut without any tension, and the world becomes a soft red darkness, filled with the afterimages of the glaring valley, small floating shapes of gold and violet that drift slowly across your inner vision. The sounds around you become more distinct in the absence of sight, the slow, even breathing of the painter next to you, the distant tap-tap of the stonecutter's chisel, the faint rustle of a hot breeze moving across the gravel, the high, thin call of a bird somewhere far overhead that you cannot see. These sounds blend together into a quiet tapestry, a gentle, repetitive pattern that asks nothing of you and requires no response. You do not sleep, not exactly. The rest is a state that lies somewhere between waking and sleeping, a drifting awareness where your thoughts become slow and liquid and the boundaries between one moment and the next begin to soften. You are aware of the weight of your own body against the stone, the solidity of the ground beneath your sandals, the slight itch of dried sweat on your forearms, but these sensations are distant and unimportant, like messages from a far-off place that you are in no hurry to receive. Time passes without measure, the way it always passes in the valley during the midday rest, a slow, gentle current that carries you along without any sense of urgency or destination. Sometimes a thought surfaces in your mind, a fragment of the morning's work, or a memory of a color you mixed last week, or a vague anticipation of the afternoon ahead, but each thought drifts away again almost immediately, dissolving back into the warm, quiet darkness behind your closed eyes. At some point you become aware that the angle of the light has shifted slightly, the shadow cast by the boulder creeping just a little farther across the ground, and you open your eyes without any sudden movement, letting the world return gradually. The valley is still bright and hot, the sun still high, though now just past its zenith, and the heat shimmer still rises from the rocks in ceaseless waves. The other painters are stirring as well, some still leaning with their eyes closed, others sitting up and stretching their arms, and one or two are taking a last drink from the water skin before stopping it and setting it aside. No one has spoken during the entire rest, and no one speaks now. The quiet is simply a continuation of the same deep silence that has held the valley since you emerged from the tomb. You sit up slowly, feeling the stiffness in your back where it had pressed against the stone, and you roll your neck from side to side to loosen the muscles there. The break has done its quiet work, drawing the tiredness from your limbs and replacing it with a calm, steady readiness, a willingness to return to the cool darkness of the tomb and pick up your brush where you left it. You gather your bag and rise to your feet, and the senior painter, seeing that everyone is awake and prepared, gives another small gesture of his hand, a subtle upward tilt of the palm that means it is time to go back inside. The group forms again into its loose single file, and you follow the others across the hot gravel toward the dark rectangle of the entrance, where the cool air waits to wrap around you once more. You re-enter the tomb behind the other painters, stepping from the blazing white of the valley into the dim corridor where the cool air closes around you like water, heavy with the familiar smell of damp plaster and lamp soot, and the faint mineral breath of the living rock. Your eyes adjust more quickly this time, the transition from glare to shadow, a practiced routine that your body knows without instruction, and by the time you reach the inner chamber, the lamp flames have resolved into steady golden points that illuminate the walls with a soft, unwavering glow. You find your place before the south wall, where your palette and pots sit exactly as you left them on the flat stone, the lids still in place and the brushes aligned in order of thickness, and you crouch down to settle yourself on the same low stone that has served as your seat through the long morning. The stiffness in your shoulders has eased during the rest, leaving only a faint, pleasant tiredness that hums in your muscles like the distant chisel tapping through the rock, and you feel ready to resume the quiet, absorbing work of the afternoon. The master painter passes through the chamber a moment later, his shadow sliding across the grid of red lines on the far wall, and he pauses beside you to look at the section you completed in the morning, his eyes moving slowly across the overseer's finished figure, and the oxen and the harvest workers with their detailed faces and pleated kilts. He nods once, a small, economical movement that conveys approval without ceremony, and then he gestures toward the lower registers of the wall, the broad horizontal bands that run below the main scene and above the baseline, spaces that are still empty except for the faint red outlines of repeated shapes that the outline scribe drew many days ago. He tells you that the afternoon's work will be to fill these spaces with the patterns of offerings, basket after basket of fruit and jar after jar of oil, bunches of onions and bundles of papyrus stalks, rows of bread loaves and cuts of meat, all the provisions that will sustain the tomb owner in the afterlife, painted in the same sequence over and over until the registers are complete. You nod without speaking because no words are needed, and the master moves on to the next painter while you turn back to your wall and pick up the first brush you will need, a medium brush with a flat tip that is good for filling broad shapes. You begin with the row of offering baskets that occupies the uppermost of the empty registers, a long horizontal band that stretches across the entire width of your section, divided by the grid into a series of identical compartments, each 4 squares wide and 3 squares tall. The baskets have already been outlined in faint red, each one a simple trapezoid shape with a flat bottom and slightly flared sides and a curved handle that arches over the top. And within each basket, the outlines of fruit have been sketched as small circles and ovals that cluster together like stones in a riverbed. You take up the pot of brown that you mixed for the baskets themselves, a warm reddish brown that reminds you of the silt left by the receding flood, and you stir it once with the blunt stick before loading your brush. Then you touch the brush to the plaster within the outline of the first basket and fill the shape with smooth, even strokes that follow the contour of the weave, leaving the spaces where the fruit will go unpainted for now. The brown goes on easily, the plaster accepting the color without resistance, and when the first basket is filled, you move to the second and do the same, then the third, then the fourth, working your way along the row from left to right in a slow, methodical progression. Each basket receives the same brown, applied with the same strokes, the brush lifting and dipping and lifting again in a rhythm that becomes as steady as breathing, and the row of baskets gradually emerges from the plaster as a continuous band of warm earth color that anchors the register from end to end. When the baskets are all filled, you clean your brush in the cup of water and select a finer one, a brush with a pointed tip that can paint the small fruits within each basket with enough precision to keep them distinct. You dip it into the pot of red ochre and begin to fill the circles that represent dates, each one a small, neat dot of deep red that sits inside the basket's brown interior like a dart jewel, and you paint them one by one, moving from left to right across the basket and then from basket to basket along the row. The dates are all the same size, all the same spacing, and your hand settles into a rhythm of small, precise dabs that require no thought, only the quiet attention of the eye and the steady control of the fingers. After the dates, you switch to a pale yellow for the figs, using a touch of white mixed into the ochre to create a soft golden color that you apply in slightly larger ovals, each one overlapping its neighbor just enough to suggest a pile of fruit, and you give each fig a tiny brown dot at its center to represent the small opening at the top of the fruit. The figs march across the baskets in their own even row, and you notice that the time has begun to soften again, the way it always does when you are absorbed in this kind of repetitive work, the moments blending into one another so that you cannot say how long you have been painting or how many baskets you have completed. The next offering in the register is the row of wine jars, tall, elegant vessels with pointed bases and narrow necks and small loop handles near the rims, each one outlined in red and waiting for its color. You take up a slightly broader brush and the pot of yellow ochre, and you begin to fill the body of each jar with a smooth, even coat of warm yellow that represents the pale clay of the pottery, leaving the rim and the handle unpainted for the moment. The jars are each 4 squares tall and 2 squares wide, and you paint them one at a time, drawing the brush downward from the neck to the pointed base in a single long stroke that follows the curve of the outline, then filling the interior with shorter horizontal strokes that blend into a uniform surface. The yellow ochre covers the plaster completely, a soft, buttery color that glows gently in the lamplight, and you work your way along the row of jars with the same steady, repetitive motion that you used for the baskets, each jar identical to the one before it, the same height, the same width, the same placement within its 4 square grid compartment. When all the jars are yellow, you clean the brush and take up the pot of red ochre to paint the rims, which you do with a thin line around the top of each neck, a single circular stroke that you have practiced so many times your hand makes the curve without any wobble. Then you add the small handle, a loop of red, that extends from just below the rim to the shoulder of the jar, painted with 2 quick strokes that meet at the ends. The jars are now complete, a whole row of them standing in their eternal stillness, and you dip your brush again and begin the next row below them, where the outline scribe has drawn another set of jars, these ones slightly smaller, meant to hold beer rather than wine, and you paint them in the same way, the same yellow, the same red rims, the same methodical progression from left to right. The afternoon deepens around you as you work, though inside the tomb there is no way to mark the passage of the sun, except by the faint change in the quality of the light that filters down the corridor from the distant entrance. A subtle shift from brilliant white to a softer, more golden tone that you notice only when you glance up from the wall to rest your eyes. The lamp flame continues its steady hiss, a constant companion that you have long since stopped hearing consciously, and the stonecutter's chisels tap out their slow, distant rhythm through the rock, a sound so regular that it has become a kind of silence in itself. The air remains cool and dry, smelling of pigment and gum and the clean mineral dust that rises whenever you shift your position on the stone, and you are aware of a deep, drowsy quality settling over your thoughts, a gentle blurring of the edges that makes the work feel effortless and timeless. You move on to the bundles of onions that occupy the next register, a row of green and white shapes that repeat across the wall like a pattern woven into linen. The onions have been outlined as clusters of long, slender bulbs with their green stalks tied together at the top, and you begin by painting the bulbs themselves with the pot of white, using a small brush to fill each oval shape with a smooth, chalky layer that stands out brightly against the bare plaster. The white dries almost instantly to a matte finish, and you then switch to the green pot, the malachite paste that you ground so carefully in the morning, to paint the stalks that rise from each bulb and curve slightly to one side before being gathered into a bundle by a small red tie that you add with the red ochre. Each bundle is identical in size and shape, and you paint them one after another, the sequence of white bulb, green stalk, red tie repeating itself until your hand knows the rhythm so well that it continues almost without your conscious direction. You finish the row of onions and begin immediately on the bundles of papyrus stalks that alternate with them, tall, straight stems of green that are tied together in the same way, but with a different shape, narrower and more upright, and you paint the green stems first, long vertical strokes that rise from the baseline to the tie, then the white of the cut ends at the bottom, then the red tie at the middle. The two patterns, onions and papyrus, alternate across the register in a steady rhythm that your brush traces without hesitation, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of watching the empty spaces fill with orderly, repeating forms. The bread loaves come next, a long row of curved brown cones that sit on offering mats just above the jars, each one the same shape, the same size, the same warm brown that you mix by adding a tiny amount of red to the brown paste so that it takes on a slightly richer, more baked-looking hue. You paint the loaves with a medium brush, starting at the left of the row and working right. Each loaf a single curved stroke that begins at the wide base and tapers to a rounded point, the brush turning slightly at the end to create the characteristic bend of the bread. Above each loaf you add a few small seeds with the tip of the finest brush, tiny dots of pale yellow that you place in a scattered pattern across the brown surface. And then you move to the next loaf and do the same, the sequence repeating itself with a hypnotic regularity that makes the time slip by unnoticed. Occasionally you pause to dip your brush, to wipe the excess on the rim of the pot, to stretch your fingers or to take a sip of water from the flask at your side, and each time you look back at the wall you see that the row has grown a little longer, the painted loaves advancing steadily toward the right edge of your section. You lose track of how many loaves you have painted, and how many jars, and how many baskets of fruit. The numbers no longer seem important. What matters is the simple unending rhythm of the brush on the plaster, the way each stroke follows the one before it without variation, the way the wall slowly fills with color and form under your patient hand. The lamp flame flickers once as the oil level drops slightly, and the apprentice moves past on silent feet to top it up, but you barely register his presence, your attention absorbed entirely in the small world of the wall in front of you. The afternoon has stretched into a long, quiet dream of green stalks and brown baskets and yellow jars, a dream from which you have no desire to wake, and you continue painting with the same unhurried care, the brush rising and falling, the colors spreading across the plaster like water soaking into dry earth, steady and certain and calm. The light that seeps down the corridor from the distant entrance has shifted from the brilliant white of midday to a softer, more golden tone. A subtle change that tells you without words that the afternoon has run its course, and the sun is beginning its slow descent toward the western cliffs. The master painter, who has been moving quietly among the painters for the last span of time, steps into the center of the chamber and raises his hand in the same small gesture that marked the midday break, a simple lifting of the palm that everyone understands. Around you, the other painters set down their brushes with the same quiet finality, the soft clicks of reed against pottery echoing faintly in the still air. And you do the same, laying your brush across the top of your palette so that the painted tip rests in the air, suspended above the stone. The register of bread loaves you are working on is nearly complete, only a few more loaves remaining to be painted, but they will wait until tomorrow, and you accept this pause with the calm patience that has carried you through the entire day. The wall before you, with its overseer and oxen and harvest workers and its rows of baskets and jars and offerings, seems to glow softly in the lamplight, the colors muted and harmonious, and you allow yourself a quiet moment of looking, not judging or assessing, simply seeing what your hands have made. You reach for the small cup of water that has been sitting beside your palette all afternoon, its surface filmed with a fine dust of pigment particles, and you pour a little more fresh water from your flask into it, enough to clean your brushes. The first brush you take up is the finest one, the one you used for the eyes and the hieroglyphs and the tiny seeds on the bread loaves, and you dip its tip into the water and begin to work the bristles gently between your thumb and forefinger, using a slow circular rubbing motion that loosens the dried pigment from the base of the bristles. The water clouds immediately with a dark swirl of black and red, the colors mingling into a muddy brown that spreads outward in delicate tendrils. You stroke the brush against the inner edge of the cup to press out the remaining pigment, then lift it and inspect the bristles in the lamplight, checking that no color remains trapped near the ferrule where the reed binds the fibers. A faint stain will always remain, a permanent shadow of all the paintings this brush has made, but the bristles themselves are clean, and you shape the tip by rolling it gently on a dry corner of your linen cloth, restoring the sharp point for tomorrow. You set this brush aside on the clean stone and take up the next one, the medium brush you used for the baskets and the jars and the skin of the workers, and you repeat the same process. Dip, rub, stroke, inspect, shape, set aside. The water in the cup grows darker with each brush, a thick, opaque slurry of many colors mixed together, and the motion of cleaning becomes a final quiet ritual, the last task of the working day. One by one, you clean all the brushes you have used, including the broad background brush that still holds traces of Egyptian blue deep in its fibers, a color that takes longer to rinse out because the pigment particles are so fine and cling so persistently. You work the bristles with extra care, separating them with your fingernail to let the water flow through, and eventually the water that drips from the tip runs clear. You dry the brush with a clean section of the linen cloth and set it with the others, all of them now aligned in a neat row on the flat stone, their tips shaped and their handles wiped free of any pigment smudges. The cup of dirty water you carry a few paces away to a patch of rocky floor near the chamber wall where no plaster has been laid, and you pour it out slowly onto the stone, watching the dark liquid spread in a thin, glistening pool that will evaporate by morning, leaving behind only a faint stain of powdered color that will blend into the natural hues of the limestone. The cup you rinse with a splash of clean water from your flask, swirling it and dumping the rinse water onto the same patch of rock, and then you tuck the cup back into your shoulder bag. The pigment pots require attention next. You check each one, removing the small pottery lids and peering inside to assess how much color remains and whether it has dried out during the afternoon. The paste in most of the pots is still workable, its surface smooth and moist beneath a thin film that forms when pigment is exposed to air, but a few of the pots, particularly the black and the white, have begun to thicken at the edges. You add a single drop of water to each of these, using the tip of your finger to let the drop fall precisely onto the paste, and then you stir the color with the blunt stick, working the moisture through until the consistency is even again. When all the pots have been checked and adjusted, you cover each one with its pottery lid, pressing down gently to create a seal that will keep the gum binder from drying out completely overnight. The pots you gather into a small cluster on the flat stone, arranging them so that they will not be knocked over if someone passes by in the darkness, and around them you place the brushes, all pointing in the same direction, a tidy arrangement that will be waiting for you when you return in the morning. You gather your personal tools from the bag, the grinding stone, the bone spatula, the small float of smoothed wood that you use to check the plaster in the morning. Each one you wipe clean with the linen cloth, removing any pigment dust or plaster residue, and you place them into the bag one by one, feeling the familiar weight settle against your hip as the bag fills. The linen cloth itself, now stained with a rainbow of smudges, you fold into a small square and tuck into an outer pocket of the bag where it will not soil the other contents. Your water flask you check and find nearly empty, only a few swallows remaining, and you drink these last mouthfuls, the water cool and faintly metallic from the pottery, before stopping the flask and adding it to the bag. You look around the chamber one final time, scanning the floor and the bench and the corner where you sat, making sure that nothing has been forgotten, no brush left behind, no pot left uncovered. The other painters are doing the same, moving through their own small spaces with the same quiet, methodical care, and the chamber is filled with the soft sounds of lids being pressed into place and brushes being wrapped in cloth and bags being lifted onto shoulders. The apprentice moves through the chamber now, beginning the task of extinguishing the lamps. He carries a small bronze snuffer, a cone-shaped cup on the end of a long handle, and he pauses at each niche in turn, lowering the snuffer over the flame and holding it there for a moment until the wick is starved of air and the light dies with a faint hiss. The darkness spreads from lamp to lamp, a slow tide that creeps along the walls and across the ceiling, and the chamber gradually dissolves into shadow, the painted figures on the walls receding into the deep gloom until they are no longer visible at all. You stand still as the last lamp is extinguished, and the darkness becomes absolute, a profound velvety blackness that presses against your eyes with a weightless pressure. It is a darkness so complete that you cannot see your own hand in front of your face, and you stand in it without fear, because you have stood in this same darkness at the end of every working day for years, and it has become a familiar thing, almost a comfort. The air is still and cool, and you can hear the breathing of the other painters around you, the shuffle of their feet as they begin to feel their way toward the corridor, and you turn and follow the sound, one hand stretched out to touch the wall, your fingers brushing the rough stone where the plaster ends and the natural rock begins. You find the corridor by touch, the wall guiding you around the bend and into the gentle upward slope, and ahead you can see a faint rectangle of deep blue light that marks the entrance, the last glow of twilight filtering in from the world outside. Your footsteps echo softly in the narrow passage, a sound that is swallowed almost immediately by the darkness, and you follow the light as it grows gradually brighter with each step, the rectangle expanding from a distant glimmer to a doorway-sized opening filled with the dusky colors of the evening sky. When you step over the threshold and out of the tomb, the air that meets you is cool and clean and smells of sun-warmed rock, releasing its heat into the night, a dry mineral scent that is entirely different from the closed atmosphere of the chamber you have just left. The sky above the valley is a deep, soft blue, darker overhead, and lighter near the western horizon where a band of pale golden rose still lingers, the last trace of the sun that has already disappeared behind the cliffs. A few of the brightest stars have begun to show themselves, tiny points of silver that you notice without looking for them, scattered across the eastern sky like grains of salt on dark stone. The group of painters assembles loosely near the entrance, and then, without any signal, begins to walk along the path that leads out of the valley and back toward the village. You follow at your usual pace, your sandals crunching on the gravel, and the air is noticeably cooler now, the fierce heat of the afternoon replaced by a gentle, pleasant coolness that washes over your skin and makes the walk feel effortless. The rocks on either side of the path, which had been pale and glaring in the midday sun, have now taken on softer hues of grey and lavender and muted blue, their colors shifting as the light fades, and the shadows that filled the crevices during the day have spread to cover entire hillsides, merging into a single, deepening dusk. You walk with your eyes forward, watching the path unwind before you in the fading light, and the rhythm of your footsteps blends with the footsteps of those ahead and behind you, a slow, shuffling cadence that is the only sound in the vast quiet of the valley. The stonecutters have stopped their work for the day. There is no more tapping from the distant tombs, no more dust rising from fresh cuttings, and the silence is deeper than it has been at any other time, a true, complete quiet that seems to fill the entire world. As you leave the enclosed basin of the valley and emerge onto the broader slope that leads down toward the village, the sky opens up above you, and more stars appear, faint at first and then brighter as the twilight deepens until the entire dome of the heavens is dusted with light. You know these stars without knowing their names, the bright one that hangs low in the east, the tight cluster of small ones just above the horizon, the faint band of milky haze that stretches from north to south like a river of pale light. They are the same stars that shone on this path when you first walked it as an apprentice, and they will be the same stars long after you are gone, and this thought does not trouble you, but rather settles into your mind with a quiet, peaceful weight, like a stone coming to rest at the bottom of a clear pool. The path ahead descends gently, winding past the small shrine with its wilted offerings, now invisible in the darkness, past the dry stream bed with its pale, rounded stones, past the twisted scrub and the scattered boulders that stand like silent sentinels in the dusk. The air carries a faint scent of dry herb and dust, the same smell that the desert always gives off at night when the heat of the day is finally released, and you breathe it in deeply, feeling it fill your lungs with its clean, arid freshness. By the time you reach the edge of the village, the last glow of twilight has faded completely from the western sky, and the only light comes from the stars and from the small oil lamps that burn in the doorways of a few houses, tiny points of orange that flicker gently in the still air. The workshop is dark and quiet as you pass it, its courtyard empty and its benches bare, and you stop briefly to leave the communal tools that belong there, the flat grinding slab, the extra water flask, the basket that held the raw pigment lumps. You place these items in their usual spots on the shelves near the courtyard entrance, feeling your way by touch in the darkness, and then you continue along the village path toward your own house. The mud brick walls of the houses glow faintly with the reflected light of the stars, their surfaces pale and textured, and you pass doorways where families are settling in for the night, the low murmur of quiet voices drifting out into the street, the occasional soft laugh or the cry of a small child. A dog barks once somewhere in the distance, a single sharp sound that fades immediately into the night, and then the silence returns, deeper and more complete than before. Your house is dark when you reach it, the doorway a rectangle of deeper black against the pale wall, and you step inside and set your bag down on the packed earth floor beside the door. The room is cool and still, the thick mud brick walls having held the day's heat at bay, and you move through the darkness with the ease of long familiarity, finding the water jar by touch and lifting its wooden lid. You pour water from the jar into a small basin, cupping your hands to splash it onto your face, the cool liquid shocking against your skin and washing away the fine layer of dust and dried sweat that has accumulated over the day. You wash your hands next, rubbing them together to loosen the pigment stains that have settled into the creases of your palms, and then you take a clean corner of the linen cloth that hangs beside the jar and pat your face and hands dry. The water in the basin is faintly grey from the dust, and you carry it to the doorway and toss it out onto the street, where it lands with a soft patter and soaks instantly into the dry earth. You are hungry now, a quiet, steady hunger that has been growing since the midday meal, and you go to the storage area and take out another piece of flat bread, breaking it into pieces and eating them slowly while you stand looking out through the doorway at the stars. The bread is slightly stale now, drier than it was this morning, but it fills your stomach with a warm, solid weight, and you follow it with a few cold beans left from a pot near the hearth, scooping them up with your fingers and chewing them slowly. You drink another cup of water from the jar, the water cool and clean, and then you set the cup aside and take a final look around the room. The sleeping mat lies in its corner, still folded from the morning, and you unroll it and spread the linen sheet over it, smoothing the fabric with your palm so that it lies flat and unwrinkled. You remove your sandals and set them beside the door, the leather straps still warm from your feet, and you lie down on the mat with a long, slow exhalation that seems to carry the last of the day's tension out of your body. The mat is firm beneath you, the woven reeds slightly uneven in the way they always are, and the linen sheet is cool against your skin. You lie on your back with your arms at your sides, looking up at the ceiling you cannot see, and you let your thoughts drift back through the day in a slow, unhurried procession. The walk to the workshop in the pale dawn, the grinding of the malachite into fine green paste, the long hike into the valley under the climbing sun, the cool darkness of the tomb and the grid of red lines on the plaster, the slow filling of the colors and the pine details of the eyes and the hieroglyphs, the midday rest in the shade of the boulders. Each memory flows into the next without urgency, a quiet stream of images that grows softer and more distant with each passing moment. The sounds of the village fade around you, the last murmuring voices, the creak of a door being closed, the bark of the dog now silent, and all that remains is the deep, enveloping quiet of the desert night. You feel the weight of your own body pressing into the mat, the slow rise and fall of your chest, the gentle pulse of your heartbeat in your ears, and you know that tomorrow will be the same. The walk to the workshop, the grinding of the colors, the path into the valley, the cool tomb and the patient walls, the brush in your hand and the paint spreading across the plaster in slow, steady strokes. The thought is not a burden, but a comfort, a quiet promise of continuity that wraps around you like the linen sheet, and as the stars wheel silently overhead and the cool air settles into the room, you let your eyes close and your breathing deepen, and you drift gently into sleep.